our first thesis of the night, Jessica Nicole Findley, with hers entitled The ABCs of BAC. Let's give her a hand.
On the Saturday evening of April 15th, 2016, 21-year-old Forrest James McCombs was at the wheel of his friend's car. Forrest and Braden Cotrahans were off-roading at a popular spot near Utah County, riding in Braden's Ford Explorer. They were driving up a steep hill when the car lost traction on the dirt trail. It slipped and rolled 200 yards down the mountain. By the time witnesses arrived to help, Forrest was dead. Forrest and Braden were tipsy, not drunk enough to be arrested. In fact, while Forrest had been at the wheel, he had been well below the limit for drunk driving, yet it still affected him. Had he not been drinking, perhaps Forrest would have had the forethought to wear a seatbelt. Had he not been drinking, perhaps he and Braden would not have had the idea to go off-roading. Had he not been drinking, perhaps Forrest would not have driven up that steep hill while his reflexes were slowed, his eyesight blurred, his confidence boosted to a sense of immortality. Yet Forrest was under the limit, so the pair drove, and it cost Forrest his life. Since the advent of automobiles, governments have tried to regulate the dangerous combination of drinking and driving. Efforts have been made since the early 1900s to reduce drunkenness, such as early New York drunk driving laws and the drunkometer, which was an unsimplified version of the modern-day breathalyzer. Though these measures worked for a time, they were not sufficient to fix the problem of mixing high-speed, powerful machines with drunken drivers. So laws were implemented that measured the inebriation of a person, yet even these efforts were not enough to make the road safer. Inebriation measures the amount of alcohol in a person's bloodstream. This measurement is known as blood alcohol concentration or blood alcohol content, henceforth shortened to BAC. If a person has a BAC of 0.1%, that means that 0.1 grams out of every 100 grams of their bloodstream is composed of alcohol. A person can have as low a BAC as 0.005%, which affects them only a scant amount, to as high a BAC as 0.45%, at which point it is fatal to nearly everyone. Oftentimes, a person's BAC can be estimated by determining their weight and the number of standard drinks they've had within the hour. In America, a standard drink is composed of 6 fluid ounces or 14 grams of pure alcohol. Though a person's BAC depends upon their weight, gender, the time between their drinks, and the amount of food in their stomach, generally 2 to 5 drinks in an hour impairs a person beyond the current legal limit. A BAC limit is the BAC at which a person is considered legally drunk and unfit to drive. In 1939, Indiana enacted the first drunk driving law to specify BAC. At the time, that limit was 0.15%. Between the years of 1939 and 2000, little data was gathered on the subject of drunk driving, yet it continued to be an issue. The most famous anti-drunk driving organization, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, was formed in the year 1980 to combat the dangers of combining alcohol and automobiles. Though some states, such as Oregon and Utah, lowered their BAC limit to 0.08% before the year 2000, it was in this year that President Bill Clinton passed the 0.08 blood alcohol concentration bill, requiring all states to set their BAC limit to 0.08%. In some states, this law did not take effect until 2004. Lowering the BAC limit to 0.08% has made American roads safer, yet some believe this is not enough. On December 30th, 2018, Utah became the first state to lower their BAC limit to 0.05%. Utah is the sole pioneer in this new BAC limit. Other parts of the country are yet unable to see the benefits that Utah will soon be reaping, and so are not making moves towards following this trailblazing state. Though Utah is making great strides towards making the road safer, America as a whole must make a greater effort. I propose that the federal BAC limit for drivers should be lowered to 0.05%. This is for 3 reasons. First, I propose this because drinkers under the current limit do not have the ability to drive safely. Second, I propose that the federal BAC limit be lowered to 0.05% because it will boost the economic industries of ride-sharing and insurance. And third, I propose this because countries around the world have instated this lower BAC limit and seen good results. At BACs between 0.05% and 0.08%, drivers are far too intoxicated to drive properly. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, when a driver has a BAC of 0.05%, he often loses small motor skills, has difficulty with controlling the steering wheel and cannot fully focus the eyes. At a BAC of 0.8%, he often lacks full concentration, has difficulty with speed control, has short-term memory loss, and has difficulty processing information such as signal lights. The current BAC limit is intercepting drivers that are far beyond mild inhibition of cognitive abilities. If we want to make the road safer for others, intercepting drivers with a slight inhibition is a must. The bottom line is this: if it's in your blood, it's in your brain. And even a small amount of alcohol influencing the effects of your brain can have a huge impact on the choices you make while driving. In a study done on drunk driving in a driving simulator, 168 subjects were tested frequently with different BACs. The study found that in categories such as speed deviation, reaction time, and correct driving responses, drivers with a BAC of 0.06% performed worse than drivers at a level of 0.02%. For example, the average reaction time of a driver with a BAC of 0.06% was 4 seconds, while the average reaction time of a driver with a BAC of 0.02% was 3.5 seconds. In an emergency situation, this half-second difference in reaction time could be the difference between walking away and being carried away. In a review on alcohol-related reports, 175 citations were studied on the effects of alcohol on reaction time, object tracking, divided attention performance, visual function, information processing, concentration, perception, psychomotor performance, and also on driver performance measures. The study found that BACs of 0.05% and higher impair nearly all of the important components of driver performance. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the number of people that were killed in drunk driving accidents with a driver BAC of 0.08% or higher in 2003 was over 13,000. But by 2016, that number had dropped to 10,500. It takes time for laws to come to full fruition and to be fully carried out. Though the 0.08% BAC bill did not immediately take effect, it has shown that over the years, the law was generally accepted and obeyed. My proposed law should act exactly like this. Though it may take time for citizens to come to obey it, over time it will be obeyed, and that will save the lives of thousands of Americans every year. When the 0.08 BAC bill was passed in the year 2000, it lowered the BAC limit from 0.1% to 0.08%. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, when the BAC limit was lowered to 0.08%, between the years of 1983 and 2014, lowering the limit saved nearly 25,000 lives. It is estimated that lowering the limit should do the same thing. It is estimated that 1,800 lives would be saved every year if we lowered the BAC limit to 0.05%. A BAC of 0.05% does have an impact on the abilities that a driver has. This is why drivers at such a level should be taken off the roads before more lives are lost. Lowering the BAC limit to 0.05% would also boost the economic industry of ride-sharing. In August and September of 2018, Ride Guru surveyed over 1,000 participants on the subject of ride-sharing. 68% of participants responded that ride-sharing had, at one point or another, prevented them from drunk driving. If this were a representation of America as a whole, it would not only mean that Uber is benefiting financially from drunk drivers, but also that it's preventing drinkers from getting behind the wheel. In May of 2016, Uber and Lyft stopped service in Austin due to strict regulations being put into place. This displaced 10,000 Austinites from their jobs as drivers for the ride-sharing companies. But in May of 2017, Uber returned. According to monthly crime reports done by the Austin Police Department, in May of 2017, there were 415 DWI arrests in Austin. But in June of 2017, that number dropped to 361. During the year that Uber was not in Austin, the number of monthly DWI arrests never fell below 400 and went as high as 487. But the month after Uber returned, the number of DWI arrests fell by 54 arrests. This could be attributed to Uber's return as they gained back some of their customers, some of whom were potential drunk drivers. It is clear that Uber has an effect on drunk drivers and vice versa. Where the drunk are, there also will be Uber to pick them up. Drinkers are a very valuable type of customer for ride-sharing companies, as ride-sharing is convenient and safe and therefore used often. If America lowered our BAC limit to 0.05%, it would boost the ride-sharing industry, and it would also prevent drunk drivers from getting behind the wheel. In a study done on the economic cost of car crashes in 2010, the study said that alcohol-involved crashes cost $52 billion in 2010, with 84% of that, or $44 billion, occurring in crashes where the highest BAC was 0.08% or less. In 2010, crashes where the highest BAC was 0.08% or less could buy 2 Apollo 11 lunar modules today. If the BAC limit had been lowered to 0.05% back in 2010, the number of fatal crashes would have been lowered by the aforementioned 1,800. Because each fatal crash costs insurance companies an average of $669,000 due to high costs from insurance administration, legal costs, property damage, and medical care, lowering the BAC limit to 0.05 in 2010 would have saved the insurance industry an average of $1.2 billion. If this carried over to today, 9 years later, that would be about $1.4 billion saved by the insurance industry every year. Lowering the BAC limit to 0.05% would boost the economic industry of ride-sharing, as it is a fleet of designated drivers. It would also boost the economic industry of insurance. Fewer fatal crashes means fewer dollars spent on lives needlessly lost. America is considered to be industrialized overall, yet in regards to drunk driving laws, it falls far behind other developed countries. The limit has been set to 0.05% in over 20 Eurasian countries, such as France, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and Germany. In the European Union, the only countries that have a BAC limit of 0.08% or higher are Liechtenstein, Malta, and the UK, excluding Scotland. It is unreasonable for America to continue operating under a BAC limit of 0.08% when so many other countries are operating that are considered to be developed just like our own are operating under a BAC limit of 0.05%. In an article that summarized the data from half a dozen Eurasian countries that lowered their BAC limit to 0.05%, the conclusion was that lowering their BAC limit saved the country an average of between 5% to 18% of drunk driving fatalities from the instatement of the law to the years subsequent. This can be seen playing out in specific countries. In 1998, Austria lowered their BAC limit to 0.05%. They experienced a 9.5% reduction of all drunk driving fatalities. A study said that in Belgium, the BAC limit was lowered to 0.05% in 1994. The following year, in 1995, they experienced a 10% reduction of all traffic fatalities and a further 11% of reduction of all traffic fatalities in 1996. New South Wales, when they lowered their BAC limit to 0.08%, from 0.08% to 0.05%, they experienced a reduction of 8% of all traffic fatalities. And France, when they lowered their BAC limit to 0.25% in late 1995, the following year in 1996, they experienced a reduction of all traffic fatalities by 4%. Though the numbers vary from country to country, the results show that lowering the BAC limit lowers the number of traffic fatalities. If America were to follow along in these footsteps, our numbers would likely do exactly what they have done in other countries. In 2018, the number of drunk driving crashes in America accounted for 29% of all American crashes, according to the World Health Organization. That same year, Iceland, Austria, Bulgaria, Germany, Thailand, and South Korea all had BAC limits of 0.05% and had drunk driving crashes accounting for 15% or less of all crashes in that country. If America followed along with these countries and we instated a BAC limit of 0.05%, it is expected that our numbers would go along with the numbers of those other countries, cutting our current percentage in half. The fact that so many other countries that are considered to be developed like our own are operating under a BAC limit of 0.05% and seeing good results should be a wake-up call to America. As a superpower of the world, America should be leading the trend, not following it. If we want to make our roads safer, we need to join these other countries in the fight against drunk driving. By instating a BAC limit of 0.05%, we could save as many lives as possible. You might be thinking that lowering the BAC limit to 0.05% would be unfair to lighter weight people. If so, this is a concern that the American Beverage Institute shares with you. 1 beer in an hour might take a 100-pound woman beyond what is safe for her. 1 beer in an hour might take a 100-pound woman beyond the current legal limit, yet would hardly affect a 200-pound man. How could this be fair? After all, one might say, 1 beer in an hour, it is not reasonable to expect any adult to drink less than 1 beer in an hour. But the simple fact is that 1 beer would take that woman beyond what is safe for her to drive with. If we made exceptions for lighter weight people simply so that they can enjoy more alcohol within a certain time frame, the law would not be treated with the gravity it needs, and therefore would not be followed as closely as it should be. Their lightness does not give them a free pass to drive home hammered. How will drivers know whether they are under or above the limit so that they will not be driving while intoxicated? In 2013, the National Transportation Safety Board proposed that the BAC limit be lowered to 0.05%. It stated that though lowering the BAC limit would not necessarily change the number of DWI arrests, it would prevent drunk drivers from getting behind the wheel in the first place. If we lowered our BAC limit to 0.05%, it is expected that the judgment of drivers would be far less impaired than it was even at a BAC of 0.08% back in the early 2000s, and therefore they would be more likely to stop before they go too far. Perhaps you're wondering why I chose to lower the BAC limit to 0.05% and no further. It is true that in some countries in Europe and Asia, they have a BAC limit of 0.03% and 0.02%, and some countries in the world have even banned alcohol altogether. While I would like to believe that we could someday soon have no cases of drunk driving in America, it would be naive for us to bank on such a future occurring within our lifetime. Because a BAC limit of 0.05% is common on our globe, it is a reasonable next step for us to take as a country towards saving as many lives as possible. My proposal is too late for Forrest James McCombs. It is too late for the thousands of other Americans that have died on the roads in recent years because they were buzzed, but not legally drunk. We can't prevent drinking. It's a pastime ingrained into our society. Because of this, we can't prevent drinking and driving. But we can begin to make a change in our country by instating a lower legal BAC. A lower limit won't be initiated immediately, but we can begin to make the change in our own lives today. All it takes is using judgment at the bar before we drive home. By drinking less when we drive, you could help prevent yourself from becoming a statistic or help prevent someone else from being counted among the thousands of lives lost every year. By being conscious of the amount of alcohol you drink on your night out, you could help save someone else's loved ones. By asking yourself, have I had too much to drink? You could become a part of making the American road safer. Thank you.
All right, on Jessica's panel, we have Ryan Herring, who has been with the Austin Police Department for 21 years. He is currently a patrol sergeant in Southeast Austin. He is also a proud parent of a Veritas Grammar School student. And I happen to know that he worked for a long time on the DWI task force. Isn't that right? We also have Mark Bomar, who worked for San Marcos Fire Department on Engine 2. He has been arrested for DWIs 37 times. He believes the USA is far superior to Canada for multiple reasons. We also have, they send these in, and I read. They send, I read. We also have Amber Compton, who is a wife, mother, teacher, speaker, and writer. Long ago, she graduated from Duke University and enjoyed a career in technology marketing and public relations. She left that industry to become manager of the Compton household, a challenging but rewarding position she's held since 2003. Graham Donaldson is a staple on the panels. He is also my counterpart in the Thesis team. And he comes from Canada, where you are required to have a blood alcohol content of 0.05 because the roads are pretty grisly. I mean, they're full of grizzlies. Like, just they have lots of grizzlies. They're hard to deal with. Okay, so if you have a paddle in front of you. If you show me the white side, it means you have a new question. If you show me the red, it means you have a follow-up question, and you get priority. So the floor is open. Oh, sorry. Go for it. I have to take notes.
It's different than last night. Oh, it's not. Is it not? As it is? Okay. Well done. Nice job. So you talked about Europe, that they have a lower blood alcohol content limit than we do, but they also have a lower drinking age, most countries. So can you talk to me a little bit about, do you think that the 21 age limit in America affects or will affect a blood alcohol content limit success here?
Certainly. The drinking age in Europe is lower, typically, than the American drinking limit, and the driving age is typically a little bit higher. So their relationship with alcohol is a little bit different than ours. They usually learn respect for alcohol a little bit earlier on because they're drinking it early on, and they're not driving with it as much. Because of this, that might have an effect on the fact that the BAC limit is lower there at 0.05%, but a drinking age of 16, 18, we know here is damaging to your brain, so obviously we can't lower our drinking age in order to gain that respect for alcohol that might be paired with a BAC limit, a lower BAC limit, but we could at least lower the BAC limit in order to help America gain that respect for alcohol, or at least treat it with care.
So say, first off, I would love to see your thesis come to fruition.
Thank you.
In my experience, the biggest problem in impaired driving is us on many, many levels.
Mm-hmm.
There's not an adult that'll argue with you that being intoxicated is bad when you drive. But how do you sell reasonable adults that you shouldn't drive at a .05? Because we have a .08 and it's an epidemic. So how do you sell people who are fearful of getting arrested that they should put their liberty at risk even more if we lower the BAC?
How should we expect reasonable common citizens to be willing to drink less when they drive or not drink when they drive?
There are those that think a .08 is unreasonable as it is. And so if you want to lower it to 0.05 and I want to go out and have a few drinks, how do you convince me and then the collective me on that it's a good idea to have this at 0.05? And then also the legislators who me and the collective me are going to vote on, how do you get them to adopt this as well?
I would say that a BAC of a limit of 0.05% is about a behavioral change, not necessarily drinking less, but driving less when you drink. So it's not necessarily about you can't go out to the bar and have a few drinks with your friends and then get home safely. But the way to get home safely would be to take an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi or have a designated driver drive you home. But I think we need to let people know that it's not worth the risk of saying, oh, I'm all right, I can drive home with a few beers in my system. I think that there are other better options that would be safer in the long run for America as a whole.
Just to follow up on that one, Jessica, first of all, great job. So then why not have a law? In your presentation you said if it's in the blood, it's in the brain. Mm-hmm. So why even have any blood alcohol content laws? Why not have the law be 0.0?
I think lowering the BAC limit to 0 would be too great of a societal change right now. I think a BAC limit of 0 would be ideal. It's not common, but I think it would be ideal. It's just we can't have such a big change. Like on a highway, if we change the speed limit from 60 to 30, that would be too big of a change, I think, for people to.
So then, can you speak to how point 8 to point 5 is less of a societal change, even though it is still a change? Why is that? Why do you think that that one's going to take, whereas up to 0 is not going to fly?
A BAC of 0.08 impairs people in generally 2 to 5 drinks, while a BAC of 0.05 impairs them between 1 to 4 drinks in an hour, depending on several different factors. But I think people will be willing to drink maybe one less drink when they drive because of the new implemented law.
And then just last question on this train of thought. So when you said we originally had a 0.1 and that was lowered to a 0.08, can you talk a little bit about how that rollout went? How long did it take for that to sink in culturally? Was it a smooth rollout? Was it difficult? Can you just give us any more information about how that change happened and how it landed?
Yes, so in the year 2000, President Bill Clinton required all states to set their BAC limit from 0.1% to 0.08%. And that was received well by most states. Some states had their BAC limits at 0.08% in 1986. So they had theirs as early as that, but some states resisted. They were required to have it set at 0.08% by 2004, or else they would have funding taken away from them by the federal government. So they all had their BAC limit set to 0.08% by 2004. And the change was not immediate, but because it was 15,000, 13,000 lives being lost every year in the early 2000s, but by around 2009, that number was dropping towards 11,000, 10,000 lives being lost, and it's kind of been coasting at about 10,000 or 11,000 since.
And was there any outcry from consumers? I mean, was there any pushback from consumers that you're aware of?
Yes, I think it's bars and the American Beverage Institute, which is a trade group that kind of protects responsible drinking in restaurants and establishments like that. They did not approve of the BAC being lowered, and they still don't approve of the BAC limit being lowered to 0.05%, simply because they're worried that people will drink less at bars, but there are other ways of getting home other than driving yourself.
I know that, is this thing working? Can you hear me? Do I sound good? I feel good.
If you hold it
I've
closer
had
to
a
your
couple
mouth.
beers already. So. Hey, so I know that Mothers Against Drunk Driving had a pretty big part in getting that down to 0.08. Where do they stand on getting down to 0.05?
What they have done to lower it to.
Are they in favor of going to 0.05, Mothers Against Drunk Driving? Do you know? I mean, sorry, should have asked that first.
No, the founder surprisingly is not. She says that there are other ways to make the road safer than lowering the BAC limit even further. She says that that would not be effective. But in general, the evidence that they do put out does point towards lowering the BAC limit.
Okay. Did I beat her? Did I beat you? Okay, cool. So one thing is creating a law. The second part is enforcing it. Right?
Yes.
So you've mentioned other, countries in the UK over there. Do they have other measures in place besides 0.05 that helps them with prevention, deterrence, whatever you want to call it?
Other than a lower drinking age and a higher driving age, I do not know about
So
that.
like in the U.S., like the 37 times I got arrested, it's because I had my seat dropped back, swerving over the road like a boss, and he pulled me over, right? But over, sorry, AJ. But in the UK, I know they've got sobriety checkpoints, and they've got higher fines. So my question is, I think it's a good idea, but how do you enforce it? Because as of right now, for the most part, if you get pulled over and get your BAC checked and your 0.08, you go to jail. I mean, would it be more beneficial if we had .05 that you had sobriety checkpoints? Would that prevent the most important thing, which is, fatalities?
Yes, I think sobriety checkpoints would help implement and make sure that the BAC law is actually working. And higher fines would also work. I also think that breathalyzer ignition interlock systems would also be helpful, but not necessarily a preventative measure, but more preventing people from repeating DWI arrests.
So by talking about checkpoints, did you in your research come across any arguments talking about areas? So rural versus urban, dense city environments versus middle of nowhere, and having different blood alcohol content requirements for those things. Maybe a lower BAC in downtown Manhattan, maybe an allowance for a higher BAC in the middle of, I don't know, Montana, nowhere, Montana. Like, did you come across arguments with that that's saying that there are zones or there are regions?
I did not see that, but I did see that in different states in America, there are different amounts of drunk driving fatalities, such as Texas is one of the highest states that has the highest number of drunk driving fatalities.
And when you were looking at those numbers, did you notice a breakdown between urban and rural, that most of these fatalities were happening on interstate highways in densely populated cities versus farm roads in rural America?
I actually did not, but I can get back to you on that.
Do you think that the BAC limits are mostly affecting slightly intoxicated folks or those that are truly drunk? Kind of where does the breakdown go? Who's really causing these accidents? People that are maybe between .05, .08, or people that are truly drunk, or drunker than that, if that's a word?
They're caused by both, but mainly by people that are binge drinking at BACs of .15 and higher, simply because their judgment, their abilities are so far gone that it's so much easier for them to get into a fatal crash. But we cannot prevent people from binge drinking and driving out unless we catch them in the act before they hit someone or something. Who we can prevent from going out and potentially risking their lives or the lives of someone else is normal, average citizens that just like to have a few beers at the bar. We could prevent them from potentially putting someone's life at risk by lowering the BAC limit to 0.05%.
Mark, did you have a follow-up still?
Yeah, kind of. It kind of goes back to the whole checkpoints thing. Is it possible for somebody to have a BAC of .05 but still pass a field sobriety test?
The symptoms of a BAC limit or a BAC level does vary depending on different people. I suppose it is potentially possible that they could pass it if they were used to having that much alcohol in their system. Yeah.
Yeah, probably wasn't a good question, but it just came to my head.
So you were talking about reaction times between a blood alcohol content of .08 and a blood alcohol content of .05. What is the average reaction time when you don't have any alcohol in your system?
I do not know that.
I guess my question is it significantly lower than 3.5 seconds?
If I were to wager a guess, I would say no, simply because a BAC level of 0.02% is not all that much higher than 0. It does affect you, but not as much as a BAC of 0.05% or 0.08%. So I would say it would probably be somewhere around 3.5 seconds.
And then when you said a loss of small motor skills, can you give me some more insight into what you mean by that? I mean, I can guess, but I just want to know what exactly are we talking about by a loss of motor skills? I mean, that sounds, a loss can be a very
Yeah.
big category.
That would be like sensitivity towards the pedal when you're pressing it, or like moving your fingers, or I don't know, glancing over your shoulder, that kind of thing, like just small muscle movements.
So you mentioned, one of the things that got the states to lower from a .10 to a .08 was highway money, right? And so are you in favor of that occurring to where on the federal level they say, okay, we're going to set a benchmark for, let's say 2 years, right, for all you states to get your stuff in order, and then after 2 years we're going to lower it to .05 at the federal level. How do you square that up with states' rights and things like that, with the big federal man coming in and saying we're going to do this yet again and lowering it to a .05 regardless of its benefits?
I think that using federal power towards kind of pressing states towards implementing a law is effective, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily right. I think that it should be a choice that states make, not because they're told to, like forcefully told to, but just because they know that it's the right thing to do in order to lower the number of fatalities in their state.
So would you see then, not a mandate necessarily, but a withholding of federal funds, would you see that as the states then having a choice? Or would that be, in the mind of the states, we were forced, we didn't have a choice?
Withholding funding, I would see as more of the states having a choice. It is a little forceful, but I mean, I don't think that that would necessarily prevent them from making the decision that they believe is best for their state.
You mentioned that Utah has done this recently. What year was that they?
That was 2018,
Okay,
so about 4 months
still
ago.
really new. But has there been any indication that these economic benefits that you talked about in your second point are starting to be seen in Utah, whether that's Uber and Lyft numbers, or the other financial choice, which is the less fatalities? Any sort of numbers coming out in the past year that you've kept your eye on about the one state that's done this move?
The law was put into place about 4 months ago, so that's very recent. I actually haven't researched those numbers, but I'm not sure they would quite be available yet, simply because it's such a new law.
So would you be an advocate of self-driving cars as a solution for this problem? Typically, they're all about eliminating human error, if you will. That would eliminate the need for blood alcohol content limits, period, and Uber, period. So talk to me a little bit about that.
I would be an advocate for self-driving cars to eliminate the need for BAC limits if self-driving cars eventually became better drivers than inebriated drivers are. Currently, they still have a lot of problems with self-driving cars. They're still fixing the bugs, but I think that if self-driving cars became as good of drivers as sober drivers and predictability on what's going to happen next on the road and such, I would be an advocate for that, so long as self-driving cars were the majority of the cars on the road, or all the cars on the road. So.
And that they don't drink, self-driving
Yes.
cars.
I was going to say, so long as they're laying off the sauce. And we've
Yeah.
only got 30 seconds left, so I'm going to call it there. Thank you, Jessica.